Hello, this is Amanda, back with another video for Fairy Stamper, and today we're going to be making a very dimensional scene, but it's really only one layer. So I'm going to start off with some Dylusions Spray, and I did leave this little part in here because, YouTubers are not perfect, let's just put it that way, and some people seem to think that we are. So this bottle was clogged. This is Dylusions Fresh Lime. I pumped it a couple times. It did not spray. So I took my little tweezers here and poked that into the nozzle of the spray bottle, and it unclogged, but it sprayed all over me. And I know it's not completely in focus here, but you can still see the little splatters of green spray. It didn't only get my arm, it got all over my white t-shirt too. So yay for that. So there's a little blooper for you. All right, so now I'm moving on. After I did the fresh lime from Dylusions, I am going to mix some Oxide sprays in here too. This is Mowed Lawn. I like to mix my Dylusions dye sprays with the oxides because it lets the oxides oxidize without using any water, and I think that's a fun effect. So now we're moving on to Salvaged Patina in the Oxide spray, and then I've got some London Blue from Dylusions, and we're going to finish it off with some Villainous Potion Oxide. Now, I always want to call this Villainous Poison. Does anybody else do that, or is that just a weird thing that I do? Anyway, so it's Villainous Potion. All right, so I'm just going to move this aside here, wipe up my mat here, and yes, you could use that ink, but I decided not to. So I've got so much ink on this panel that I felt like I could make two backgrounds. So I did cut another panel. I didn't have one cut, so my bottom of my panel here got a little dry, so I'm just going to add a little bit more Mowed Lawn and that fresh lime, and then I'm going to take another card panel and just pop it right on top here. I'm going to rub it in real good, make sure we get some good contact for this ink sandwich, and rub my brayer on it, and then we will pull it apart here, and you'll see that I have two fabulous backgrounds here. So I did take that one that I had on top. It did have a couple little white spots on it. It probably wouldn't be a big deal because I usually cut my backgrounds down anyway, but I am going to use the excess ink on my glass mat here and just try to fill in those little white spots along the edges. There's one in the middle, there's one on the top. I'm just going to do some ink smushing here and just kind of fill that in a little bit, just in case I don't want to cut this down when I use it. We're not using this one today, but I do have a fabulous background that I can use on another day. So just going to finish up some ink smushing here, and then we will set that aside and we will work on the other background. All right, so I have a stencil here from Studio Light. This is called the Essentials Mask Stencil. So it's got some mountains, it has some grass, it's a fabulous stencil, and this should be available at the Fairy Stamper store. It was when I bought it, but I'm not sure if it still is. I will have it linked in the description box below if it is still available. So with this, I decided to do, so with Copic markers, if you don't have enough colors and you want something darker, you use a gray marker. So I thought that this should work with Distress inks as well, because Distress inks are transparent. So I brought in Iced Spruce because it's kind of a grayish bluish color, and I figured that I would just use that to shade my mountains. And it did work. I pulled up my stencil and I could see that it worked, but I wanted something a little darker, so I came in with Dusty Concord. That did make it darker. I was still looking for even more contrast, so I brought in just a tiny bit of black soot up at the top of the peaks of the mountains. So that's what we're working on here, and I did just use a tiny little bit. I think I only went into the ink pad twice, and I'm brushing that all along the top of those peaks. So then we will remove the stencil here in just a second. Yep, right there. And you will see how these mountains look. They're subtle, but not too subtle. You can still see them on the background, but I love the way that turned out. So now I'm going to add another set of mountains. We're going to use the slightly smaller the medium set of mountains, I guess, here. I'm going to line those up, and I do have pixie spray on the back of my stencil here, but I'm also using Post-it note tape to mask off the stencils because I am a messy ink blender, and I knew that I would go into the other parts of the stencil if I didn't. Plus this middle set is smaller, and I wanted to make sure that the line still ended where the line ended on the bigger stencil, if that makes sense. You saw that, like, I wouldn't really call it a horizon line, but the bottom of the mountain. So I want to keep that same line that original stencil made. I didn't want to keep making it go down further and further, if that makes any sense. So now I'm doing the same thing. I started with Dusty Concord this time because I'm like, all right, so I want to start with that Dusty Concord because I want that darker hue. So that's what I'm going to do. I don't believe I used black soot on this one. I'm just going to use the Dusty Concord and the iced spruce here. And then we will see how that turns out. Just finishing up. And pull that stencil back. And that one looks fabulous as well. And then I decided I wanted one more layer to my mountains because there are 3 mountain stencils on here. So I figured, why not just use them all? So we're going to line that up exactly where I want it. And again, we're going to mark that off with Post-it tape on the bottom and the top. And you can see that straight line there. That is why I'm putting the Post-it note tape on the bottom, is I want to keep that line crisp. And I don't want it to go down any further than I originally had it. So we're just going to do this one real quick. We're going to start with the ice spruce this time because why not? I do go back and do the Dusty Concord, and then I go back to the ice spruce on this one. But I don't think it really matters here. I'm just going to pull that up and see if that was dark enough, and it was not. That is the other good thing about using the Post-it notes, is I mean, even though I've got the pixie spray on there, I think if the pixie spray was just there by itself, I probably would have shifted the stencils. You may be better at that than I am, but I am not. Now we're just going to finish up here with the iced spruce real quick, and then that will finish our mountains. And as you can see, we've got a nice dimensional set of mountains there. So I did decide I wanted to use the grass on this, so I'm going to do that. Now in the finished card, you can't really see the grass much, but that's okay. I did it, so I'm going to leave it in and have you see it. But if you wanted to see the grass more, I think what I would do next time is that I would wait until the end after all my stamping and do the grass again, but I would use oxides instead of the distress ink because, like I said, dye inks are transparent. So once I did all the stamping over the grass, you really couldn't see it. It kind of faded off into the background. But if you use oxides, they are opaque, and so it would have covered up some of that stamping that I did over this, and it would bring it more to the foreground. It just depends on what you're looking for, I guess. So that was the bigger grass stencil. Now we're going to do the smaller grass stencil, and because this one is smaller and I want it to show up, I'm going to use a darker ink. Even though theoretically you would want your darker grass in the background, but whatever. This is my card and that's how I'm going to do it. So I knew that if I tried to ink blend this in a lighter color than I did the bigger grass, it really wasn't going to show up. Again, unless you used oxides, I guess. So just finish that up. That's peeled paint. The other one was Mowed Lawn. And then that finishes off the stenciling, and we're going to move to some stamping. So I'm going to use the Hanging Vines from Fairy Hugs, and I'm stamping this in Shady Lane from VersaFine Clair. Yes, these are supposed to be hanging from the top, but hey, I thought it looked like some nice foliage that we could put from the bottom, so that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to stagger these, make some longer, some shorter, and I did misstamp that, so I'm going to get my head right in the way so I can try to line that up again. This is why I typically use a stamp platform, because I am a terrible stamper with a stamp block. But I knew that I'd be stamping these over and over and over again, and it would be kind of, it would take a lot longer to stamp it if I used my stamp positioner. So this is there are 2 stamps in the Hanging Vines stamp set. And so I'm using the second one. This one is, one has open leaves and one has solid leaves. And then one is like wider and one's skinnier. I believe the skinnier one has the open leaves, but don't quote me on that one. But anyway, so I'm just going to use this one, and I'm doing this one in pine cone, so it's brown, so it looks like it's a different plant entirely. It doesn't really look that different than the other one, but it does look different when you stamp it in a different color. At least I thought it did. All right, so now we're going to move on to the fantasy flowers. This is one of my favorite like plant type ones in the Fairy Hug lines. I use this a lot. So there's 4 flowers in this stamp set. This is 2 of them. We got 2 short ones and 2 long ones. So I'm just going to stamp this in Dandelion ink from Wendy Vecchi's Make Art Blendable inks, I believe is what they're called. It popped up on the screen, and it'll be in the description box below. So I just want these to be very subtle, so I did stamp them in a light yellow. It doesn't show up on camera nearly as much as it shows up in person, but they are there, I promise you. So I'm just going to stamp those a couple times. We will come back to these in a minute, and I'll fill some more of the background images in. So when you want a full scene, you want to have things in different colors. You want things in lighter colors and darker colors, so it kind of goes into the foreground and into the background and that kind of stuff. So that is why I chose to do those in yellow, if I could talk today, so that they would go more into the background. So now we've got the toadstool and the dotted mushrooms, and we are stamping those in one of the Wendy Vecchi inks, and this one is potting soil, I believe. And so I wanted these to be more in the foreground, so that is why they are in a darker ink. So I'm just going to get those stamped up real quick, and then I'm going to take that toadstool and move it over to the other side. So we've got more of a visual triangle with the mushrooms, and stamp that off the page there. And then I believe we're going to stamp more of those fantasy flowers. Yes, we are. So I picked out 2 more of the the taller fantasy flowers, and we're going to stamp those in that dandelion color again, just to fill in my background a bit more. All right, so now we're going to get to some little fairies. I thought that the little condo dweller number 2 set fairies, either one would work though. There's a number 1 and a number 2, but I do like these little tiny fairies because they kind of, sometimes when you don't have room for the bigger fairies, which I don't know, I probably could have fit a bigger fairy on here, but I like the little condo dwellers. So anyway, I put in 4 of them here in random little spots. And now we're going to do some heat embossing. I decided that I wanted a moon and a sentiment, and I wanted them to stand out a little bit against my busy background. So we are going to put in, I want to say this is moon dust, but it'll pop up on the screen here in a second, and make a wish for the sentiment. Yes, it is moon dust. Oh, I'm on a roll today. All right, so I'm going to pop those in there, and we're going to stamp this in Versamark, and we're going to white heat emboss it. So I did use my anti-static powder tool there, even though, and I did heat set this off screen too, and even though I did all that, my white powder still stuck everywhere. I didn't want it to. I tried to brush it off. For the most part, I got some off, and some of it was just too hard to get off, so I ended up with little white specks everywhere. So to fix that, I took some of the white Dylusions ink. This is all off screen, by the way. My camera turned off and I didn't notice it did. So anyway, to finish up the card, while we're finishing this up, I did splatter some white Dylusions ink on there. I took some metallic and glitter gel pens, and I dotted those everywhere to kind of hide my embossing boo-boo. I did color in the mushrooms. I colored in the fairy wings. I mounted it on some black cardstock. And I did color over some of those fantasy flowers with some glitter pens and stuff to make them a little shinier, because you can never have too much glitter on a fairy card, in my opinion. I think I colored in some of those leaves too from the foliage down below, the ones that were not filled in. I believe that's all that I did. So If you want any of the links for the products that I use, they'll be in the description box below. There is also a link to the Fairy Stamper Hugs Facebook page where there are challenges and stuff that you can participate in and share your projects. And there are links to my social media if you're watching this over on the Fairy Hugs YouTube page. If you're watching this on mine, there are links to their social media. And as always, have a great day.